Welcome to the Alaska Weather Show. I'm meteorologist Peter Chan, coming to you from the National Weather Service in this special partnership with Alaska Public Media. And we're going to take a look at what's going on weather-wise across the state on this Monday, February 28th, 2022. It's hard to believe we're already through the month of February, and will March come in like a lion or lamb? Well, generally a lamb. Pretty quiet weather statewide expected early this week, even into Tuesday. Though of note, Juneau passes along in the January and February of this year. They've already received more precipitation than they normally receive for the 3-month period of January through March. And they've received 22.81 inches of rain, melted snow, any melted ice. And that's just through February. We still have March to go. And that beats the old 3-month record for January through February of 22.3 inches set in 1992. Keep in mind they had a couple of pretty significant atmospheric river events late this fall into the winter time. And we could see a more active pattern emerge again as some North Pacific lows will be lifting across the Aleutians into the Bering, as well as up the western side of the Gulf, beginning later this week through the weekend into next week. This is going to lead to a push of milder and more moist air at times. So we expect above normal temperatures and precipitation over the mainland, especially as we go through next week, centered on the southwest and then moving into the central interior, especially along and just north of the Alaska Range. So we definitely have some milder air returning again here by next week. But otherwise, no hazardous weather. We don't have any watches, warnings, or advisories currently in effect for the mainland, the southeast panhandle, or the Alaska Peninsula. About the only warnings we have are some gale warnings out along the Aleutian chain, and that's pretty mild for them. They're used to some pretty hefty winds and waves in that part of the state. But otherwise, we have some interesting news to pass along technology-wise. We're going to have a GOES satellite. It's a geosynchronous environmental satellite for weather launch tomorrow. NASA is going to take care of this launch. It's initially GOES-T, and once everything hopefully goes successfully, it will be renamed GOES-18 to replace GOES-17, because about 4 years ago, GOES-17 was launched and there was a problem with one of the imagers. So this is going to take care of it. And this satellite is critical for areas of the western United States on up to Alaska, about as far north and west as it can see as Alaska and parts of the Bering. So this is an important weather tool for us in the National Weather Service when it comes to our forecasting and warning. Another interesting note, the Hunga Tonga eruption that occurred in the South Pacific on January 15th created a plume of aerosols and volcanic ash that extended 36 miles above the surface all the way up into the mesosphere. That's above the stratosphere. And at least in modern space age recording times, this is the most significant eruption. You have to go way back to 1883, Krakatoa, or Tambora back in 1815. Those two eruptions were bigger than the one here we saw in January, but nevertheless, that's an impressive fact that we've seen these volcanic aerosols shot up all the way as high as 36 miles into the mesosphere, certainly up through the stratosphere. So at times I would expect we're going to see where those aerosols, where they tend to circulate around the Earth, we could see some pretty good spectacular sunrises and sunsets here in the coming months. Well, let's look at the satellite imagery. Pretty quiet across the state. We have some patchy light snow occurring up there from the northwest coast down through the central interior, east side of the Alaska Range. A few light showers lingering in parts of the panhandle. Most significant weather is curled up low there just to the west-southwest of Shimia, way on the western end of the Aleutians. That's what's bringing a frontal system up through Adak, and that's going to bring windy, showery weather there for the central and western Aleutians as we go through tonight and into tomorrow. That low will be situated in 961 low there in the western Aleutians. Weak high pressure up in the northwest, still some patchy light snow up across the western Brooks Range and northwest coast. Also a few light mixed showers along
along the Kenai and Kodiak Island coast, with some patchy light snow showers or flurries along the Alaska Range down into parts of Cook Inlet. And into Tuesday, just that little weak area of lingering low pressure that was over the Gulf just kind of washes out. There's a trough that rides along the outer coast of the Panhandle with that weak high pressure up there along the northwest coast. More importantly, see kind of a secondary low develop there toward the central Aleutians with a frontal system that's going to lift northeastward as we go into Wednesday. And once we start getting past Wednesday, that's when we're going to get the pattern get a little more active as those lows come up out of the North Pacific and cross the Aleutians into the Bering or into the Western Gulf. Quick in a step through the temperatures, not nearly as cold as what it's been here the past couple of weeks in the north. Temperatures have moderated. On Tuesday afternoon, we expect readings above freezing. South central areas and along the Gulf Coast with some 40s possible there in the southern outer Panhandle, as well as extending out through the Aleutians. And Wednesday morning lows, again, sub-zero in a few spots there, like the Yukon Flats, Arctic Village, maybe around 9-10 below. But daytime highs, most areas, we're going to be getting back up above zero with temperatures rising near to above freezing across the southern third of the state, and certainly above freezing there along any of the coastal waters. Tuesday morning lows, the Panhandle, looking at temperatures generally a little above freezing there on the south and outer coast, a little below freezing there, 27 at Anchorage and 35 there. Come Tuesday afternoon, 40 at Kodiak, lower 40s there, Craig, Sitka. And then Wednesday morning, we expect similar lows back in the 20s as you get away from the coast. But most coastal areas, upper 20s, lower 30s, few spots stay above freezing. Very similar temperature regime, at least coming up here through this week. Though it will get warmer, especially across the western, southern parts of the mainland as we go into next week. Tuesday morning lows below zero there up through the northeast. And then temperatures again Wednesday morning back down below zero along the Arctic coast and northeast, but not as sharply cold as they were here the past week or two. And temperatures up the Yukon Valley, starting to see some 20-degree readings. Along the southwest coast, temperatures will stay in the single digits, generally to lower teens above zero. And then daytime highs Tuesday afternoon should manage to get back up above freezing, especially from around, King Salmon southwestward out along the Aleutian chain, including Kodiak. And then on Wednesday morning lows, again, the interior, southwest interior, Aniak, lower mid-teens with afternoon highs approaching freezing there by Wednesday afternoon, and definitely above freezing Dillingham, King Salmon, and especially the Kenai southwestward across the Aleutian chain. Now we're going to take a quick look at the temperature forecast. 6 to 10 day temperature outlook for March 6th through the 10th as we get into next week. And there's a very high probability of above normal temperatures being centered on the southwest part of the state. As I mentioned, these North Pacific lows are going to bring low pressure and frontal systems advancing northeastward, and with each one, a little milder, moist air is going to be arriving, so each time it's going to help bump the temperatures up. So don't be surprised if some areas could end up seeing some temperatures again in the 40s, especially along coastal areas, and that's much of the state. As far as precipitation goes, we do expect a broad area of a bit above normal precipitation there across the mainland, especially running along the Yukon River Valley and along and north of the Alaska Range. Could end up seeing a little below normal precipitation for a change there across the southeast Panhandle after a very wet start to 2000.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Well, it's now time for aviation weather, and if you do have a flight planned Tuesday into Wednesday, most of the weather action is going to be out toward the Aleutians and then creeping up along the Alaska Peninsula. We have one low on Tuesday that's going to be out toward the southwest Bering Sea, the western half of the Aleutians, and then as we go through the day and into Wednesday, secondary low is going to kind of spin up through the central Aleutians with yet another low coming out of the North Pacific and on up toward the eastern Aleutians and tip of the Alaska Peninsula there. Nevertheless, this is going to eventually lead to kind of a parade train of North Pacific lows that'll be increasing over the weekend and into next week. So the pattern will become more active here as we go through the latter half of this week and especially by next week. But in the meantime, we expect IFR conditions across the Gulf, portions southern two-thirds of the Panhandle, southwest coast there, Bristol Bay, Kodiak Island to all the way along Nunavik Island up to St. Lawrence, as well as back out toward the central and western Aleutians. And as we go through Tuesday afternoon, we see widespread areas of MVFR conditions across the mainland, especially the Alaska and Brooks Range up toward the northwest coast. Should at least the IFR conditions abate a bit there in the Panhandle, with widespread IFR conditions from the southwest coast, lower Kuskokwim Delta and Bristol Bay out over much of the Bering, extending off southwestward there from the Alaska Peninsula into the Aleutians. Wednesday morning, we'll see again areas of MVFR there across the interior around the Alaska Range and along and south of the Brooks Range. Small area of IFR conditions there along the northwest coast, and then also still out over the Central Gulf, and then back along the Alaska Peninsula and just along the southwest coast. There you can kind of see the arc associated with the frontal system, and then back out toward the central Aleutians. And by Wednesday afternoon, widespread IFR conditions across much of the Bering, nudging up to the southwest coast and pushing up into through the central Gulf Coast, all the way up there through Kodiak Island, the mouth of Cook Inlet. So past conditions for Anaktuvuk and Aitken passes will be MVFR. And as we go further south and west along the Alaska Range, we expect widespread MVFR conditions, Lake Clark and Merrill, rounding up there to the north and west, Rainy Pass, as well as Windy Pass there in the central Alaska Range, and then further east, the eastern Alaska Range, Isabel, and Metasta should see MVFR conditions throughout the day on Tuesday. Further south and west, Tanita will see MVFR conditions. And over Portage Pass, IFR conditions will start out on the eastern half in the morning, giving way to MVFR conditions. The west entrance will see MVFR conditions give way to VFR conditions. And then the northern Panhandle, Chilkoot and White, will generally see MVFR conditions on Tuesday. Overall temperatures have cooled a bit there in the mainland, but not drastically colder. We see the surface freezing line Tuesday morning along the inner channels of the Panhandle, northern Gulf Coast, extending just south of Kodiak Island across the tip of the Alaska Peninsula. And then we see freezing levels around 2,000 feet and rising as you go down along the British Columbia coast toward Vancouver and then south of the central Aleutians. Greatest threat for icing will be a small pocket there along the British Columbia coast there, just east of Haida Gwaii and to the north there of Vancouver. And then an area out through the central Aleutians between 5,000 and 12,000 feet as an area of low pressure will be working its way there into the central Aleutians. At the upper level, 30,000-foot jet stream level, winds are not especially strong over the mainland, relatively quiet, a band of 70-knot winds out there over the lower Aleutians, generally out of the south-southeast. And as we drop down to mid-levels at 9,000 feet, strongest winds are along the Kamchatka coast out into the southwest Bering, head of low pressure there, 45 to 65-knot winds, and then an area of 45 to near 50-knot winds there, the eastern Aleutians toward the tip of the Alaska Peninsula. And as we drop down further to 3,000 feet, we see a broader band of winds between 45 to as high as 65 knots from the North Pacific there, running up through the eastern Aleutians and then continuing into the central Bering all the way to the Kamchatka coast. And that will translate to turbulence. Look for moderate turbulence along the Aleutian chain with isolated severe turbulence through portions of the central and eastern Aleutians, primarily between the surface and 3,000 feet. So there's your flight weather heading into midweek. If you do manage to get out for a flight, make sure you check the latest conditions and forecast. And if you can get out, have a safe flight.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Carrie Haisley, Chief of the Emergency Services and Multimedia Branch for the National Weather Service in Anchorage. With me today I have Dr. Doug Wesley, a physical scientist for the National Weather Service Alaska Region Headquarters. Doug, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome, Carrie. Hello.
Hello. So you're here to talk to us a little bit about something called AKwx, which is the Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. And I understand that AKwx is a network of volunteers who take weather observations. Can you tell us a little bit more about what AKwx is?
Yes, it began in the lower 48, 20 some years ago, and it's expanded during those 2 decades. They're getting something like 10 to 15,000 rainfall reports per day from the lower 48.
Wow, that's a lot of different reports. So, how many reports do we get in Alaska right now?
Well, it varies, maybe 10 to 25. But if you consider the large areas we're talking about, we have a lot of gaps to fill. Any observation is better than no observation, but there are large areas in Alaska. Alaska covers 3 million square miles. There's a lot of data gaps in that space, so we'd like to enhance it.
Sure. So, tell us then a bit about why these observations are so important to Alaska and why we need to expand the number of them that we're getting.
Yes, Alaska, as you know, has large areas with a lot of complex terrain, and there are no weather observing stations or radar. So CoCoRaHS can help fill the data gaps, so you can at least get some idea of what's actually falling from the sky at those locations. CoCoRaHS increases the amount of timely weather observations available to meteorologists and other decision makers, especially in hazardous type of weather, uh, both rain and snow and the occasional hailstorm that we get up here. CoCoRaHS observations can help forecasters identify long-term precipitation and snowfall trends in a climate sense. And just overall, they increase the amount of timely weather observations available to the public.
So, then let's talk a little bit about each of the different types of observations. So, it's the rain, hail, and snow network. So, let's start by talking a little bit about rain observations and tell us a little bit about how you take those and how long it takes a volunteer to get a rain observation.
Okay, this is a 4-inch gauge, just the basic gauge, which you use for both rain and snowfall. But the rain observations are pretty quick. It's a matter of 2 or 3 minutes that each volunteer goes out and takes a reading, and then they enter these on the computer, and they're immediately available for observation on the computer and on the maps, so that you can see your report. In the wintertime, it's a little bit more complicated. We require the observers to measure not only the snow accumulation, but also liquid equivalent. So they've got to melt the snowfall. This involves two of these gauges and a snowboard. And it's maybe a 10-minute observation per day during the winter. But the snowfall is so variable that even across town and in especially the remote areas, it's crucial that we increase this number of snow observations in the network.
Right. I understand that we can only take observations in places where we have weather service offices. And so we rely on all of these volunteers to help us fill gaps. And it's also interesting to know how snowfall varies across like large spaces or even small cities. So I notice here in Anchorage, for example, we can have a vastly different amount of snow on the east side of town and the west side of town. And so it seems like these observations would help us to better understand what's going on in places besides just where the office is.
That's correct. In any given snowfall, there are typically large variances, as you know, and we rely on reports from the public and from National Weather Service cooperative spotters to map out the snowfall that occurs, so that we can predict it better in the future.
Sure. So we talked about rain observations and we talked about snow observations. And you said for each of those, if it's rain, it only takes a couple minutes and then it can take about 10 minutes if it's snow. Hail was the other one that we didn't talk about yet. Tell us just a little bit about the hail observations that CoCoRaHS observers take.
Yeah, the CoCoRaHS network, it has a hail pad, and it's just a simple block of styrofoam covered with aluminum foil, and you can approximate the size of hail by measuring the dent that the hail causes on the pad. And this can give us an estimate of hail size. We don't get hail very often in Alaska, but I've seen it 2 or 3 times in my 5 years in Anchorage, and some of it up to a half inch. And I'm sure there's been larger hail up in the interior at times.
So let's talk a little bit about how these rain, hail, and snow observations can help forecasters. So we have people who forecast the weather, and we also have people who work on the hydrology side. And I can see that maybe CoCoRaHS will be beneficial to both of them. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, it's beneficial to the hydrologic forecaster who's concerned about flooding, and rainfall comprises one of the causes of a flood, or it can exacerbate high water conditions. So the more the hydrologist has to look at in terms of data from recent rainfall, the more information they have to work with when they're generating a forecast. The weather forecasters in the wintertime at the Weather Service office can use these observations also to help with past case studies, to verify model data, and to get a handle on what's actually happening out the window. And that's important in the forecast process.
Yeah, it seems like you can never have too much information when you're issuing a forecast. So it only takes a few minutes most of the time to take these observations. So let's say I'm interested in becoming a volunteer for CoCoRaHS. How do I get involved?
Yeah, the website is very useful, cocorahs.org, and it has a number of video-based training tutorials that take you right on from measuring rainfall to a video tutorial on measuring snowfall. It has the maps available in real time, and you can go back and look at that old data too through those maps. And so it's a very useful, comprehensive website.
Very interesting. And anybody can get involved, right? You don't have to be a meteorologist.
That's right. And, we love to have 24, once a day reports throughout the year, but if you can't, then so be it. And we have observers, some observers are out of town for periods of time, or maybe they can only report, a week or two of precipitation, but it's still useful. It's still data that we look at. So the more the better, but you can get involved even if you aren't at a location 24/7.
Doug, I really appreciate you coming on to our program today to talk about CoCoRaHS. Hopefully we can have you back in the studio at some point so we can talk more about it and then talk more about the different types of observations and the tools that observers use.
That would be great. Yeah.
So thank you for your time, and thank you so much for joining this edition of Alaska Weather Facts.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back, and now we'll take a look at the sea ice edge. We'll start out with the Arctic coast into the lower Chukchi Sea and Bering Strait. Overall, the ice is going to tend to reform, even though the air mass isn't as cold as it's been the past week or two. Temperatures will remain well below freezing, so any ice reformation is likely, and the winds are not going to be especially strong, at least not as strong as in the past week or so. And as we go down along the southwest coast, the areas of ice that have opened up and broke away from the west and say north sides of some of the shoreline will have a tendency, I think, later on in the week and by the weekend, and certainly next week, we're going to see a pattern where North Pacific lows are working their way northeastward with frontal systems. So this is going to have a tendency to want to push the ice, have it retreat back to the north later in the week and certainly by over the weekend. Looking at the marine forecast for the Panhandle on Tuesday, the inner canals will see winds generally out of the north, 15 to 20 knots, Petersburg on up through Lynn Canal there, Juneau, Skagway. Waves 3-4 feet. Winds a little more lighter and variable, 5 to 10 knots, the south-southwest end of the Panhandle, including the outer coast. And waves generally along the Gulf Coast, 6-7 feet at best. And then Wednesday, winds will continue out of the north-northwest through the inner channels at about 10 to 15 knots, waves 2 to 3 feet. And then along the Gulf Coast, winds will be westerly, Yakutat westward, but then turn northwest and northerly as you get south of Sitka and pick up to about 20 knots, waves 6 to 8 feet. Across the northwest Gulf on Tuesday, winds are going to be rather variable, and on the light side, we have a weak area of low pressure just kind of lingering in this area. It'll continue to weaken, but look for variable winds around 10 knots, Prince William Sound off the Kenai Peninsula, maybe northeasterly 15 knots, waves running a few feet there, Homer down toward the entrance of Cook Inlet. By Wednesday, a frontal system approaching from the southwest is going to cause the winds at the entrance of Cook Inlet in there northeast of Kodiak to pick up to about 30 to 35 knots. And we'll see winds across Prince William Sound, still rather light from the southeast at about 10 knots and waves a couple of feet. Across Kodiak Island on Tuesday, winds will generally be from the southwest around 15 knots. Look for winds, though, to pick up as you extend down the length of the Alaska Peninsula. You get down toward Sand Point in there north of Cold Bay, 30 to 35 knot east to southeast winds. Waves running 6 to 8 feet on the North Pacific side, maybe 3 to 5 feet on the Bering side. And then on Wednesday, winds will either be out of the east-southeast there across the northern area of the peninsula and Kodiak Island, and waves could be as high as 12 to 13 feet on the North Pacific side and maybe 4 to 6 feet on the Bering side. On Tuesday, much of the Aleutian chain, especially the central and eastern Aleutians, will have gale force winds to 40 knots, generally out of the east-southeast waves, running 13 to 17 feet on the North Pacific side and about 10 to 14 feet on the Bering side, though you could see waves 20 to 25 feet once you get west of Adak toward Kiska and Shemya. And then on Wednesday, with low pressure emerging there up through the central Bering, we expect winds to be south-southwest over the eastern half of the Aleutians as high as 35 to 40 knots. Waves anywhere from, say, 18 to 25 feet on the North Pacific side and 12 to as high as 20 feet there just north of Adak and Atka on the Bering side. Across the west and southwest coast, winds will generally be out of the east around 15 to 20 knots where the ice is in place, up to 30 knots at St. Paul and St. George with waves perhaps as high as 8-9 feet. And then on Wednesday, winds will still generally be out of the east, northeast at around 25 to 30 knots, though it could be a little stronger, 35-knot winds there around St. Matthew with the ice in place. And then for the Arctic coast, Kaktovik will be up around 30 knots from the east, but winds will turn northeasterly around 10 knots, lower Chukchi toward the strait. And as we go into Wednesday, we expect lighter winds throughout the region, generally 10 to 15 knots, not just along the Arctic coast, but down through the lower Chukchi Sea. Though winds may pick up, accelerate a bit through the Bering Strait, off of Wales and Port Clarence to the north side of St. Lawrence Island. We could see northeast winds to 25 knots. And a quick check of the weather map. For Tuesday afternoon, we have a couple of lows working their way through the western and central Aleutians. That'll produce those gale force winds. And lagging trough, lingering trough there up through along the north central Gulf and just off of the Panhandle. And then by Wednesday, frontal system works its way up along the Alaska Peninsula, and a low there in the central portion of the Bering Sea will signal a change toward a more active pattern as we head into the end of the week.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.